But right now we're going to stay in Chicago, where the first May Day began. May 1st, May Day, International Workers' Day. Day is an official government holiday in most countries, with mass demonstrations, rallies, and marches being held to express labor solidarity and celebrate workers' rights. Here in the United States, May Day is not a government-sanctioned holiday, even though the commemoration originated here. However, this year, immigrant groups have chosen this day to stage a work strike and take part in this one-day economic boycott to protest anti-immigrant legislation being considered by Congress. Millions are expected to participate in all sorts of events, from boycott to others taking place around the country. But first, we want to talk about May Day, the Haymarket riot, which took place in Chicago in 1886. We're joined in the studio by James Green, professor of history and labor studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, author of a new book called Death in the Haymarket, a story of Chicago, the first labor movement and the bombing that divided Gilded Age America. We welcome you to Democracy Now!
Good morning. Happy May Day.
It's good to be with you. Let's stay in Chicago, where our last guest was, Jorge Mujica. They're going to have major plans. They have major plans for today. But it all began here 120 years ago.
Yes, it did. 120 years ago, thousands of workers and their families were marching through the streets of Chicago. It was a Saturday. Everyone left work because in those days people had to work on Saturday. They were working the 10 and 12-hour day. Most of these people were immigrants, and as your last interview just said, they were protesting as immigrant workers as well as people who were U.S. citizens and wanted to be U.S. citizens.
Where were these immigrants from?
These were immigrants mostly from Germany, from Bohemia, what is now Czechoslovakia, from France, all different parts of Europe, and this was a city where they worked in enormously large factories and found that they had been in years of depression and wanted to shorten the workday.
Talk about this period, 120 years ago. Put it in the historical context of the Civil War, of Abraham Lincoln.
Right. Well, this was a period when the United States was still living with the memory of the Civil War. Many people had fought in the Civil War, and the question was whether African Americans, who were free people, would have their rights, and whether now other people who are so-called free labor would also have their freedom. And they defined that as the 8-hour day, as getting some freedom from the long arm of the job. It was also the period when American industrial capitalism was booming. The largest corporations in America were being created then, and yet people in the United States were thinking these were bad organizations, that they could be stopped, that somehow they could create an economy that was run by local people, run by workers themselves. The things that we think are inevitable, were inevitable in the 20th century, didn't seem so in 1886.
When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, his body was brought to Chicago.
Yes, yes. My book begins on May Day, but it's May Day, May 1st, 1865, when Lincoln's body comes back to Chicago, who's a great hero of all the people and all the classes, and Chicagoans stand unified in grief that May Day. And my project in the book is to explain how in 19 years all that came apart and people became so divided from one another.
Well, talk about that, because it's also the history of labor in this country.
Yes, it was. There was really no labor movement in 1865 to speak of, but what happened was workers, many of them immigrants, felt the need to create one, partly because employers felt that they were going to freeze wages, keep wages the way they were, that any increase in wages would be a loss in profits, and they were not going to allow the workday to decrease. So people organized the labor movement, and when they did that in 1877, they faced terrible, terrible violence. About 30 people were killed in Chicago by the Chicago police, and that sets the city down a road of tension, of struggle that leads directly to Haymarket.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting today there is a debate over whether to boycott, to rally, to protest, what the protest should look like, and people are doing all different things throughout the country. The same thing was happening more than 100 years ago.
Yes, the resonance in this is amazing. And I'm a history professor, and I tell my students history doesn't repeat itself, but you have to wonder when you look at what's happening today, because the labor movement was divided then too. The main organization, the Knights of Labor, said, don't go on strike, let's talk to employers, don't boycott, let's appeal to the American people, let's appeal to the legislature. But the immigrant and the community-based groups and the radical groups, the anarchists in Chicago, were all for taking direct action and had very little faith that the legislature would do the right thing unless the people in the streets forced them to.
Mm-hmm. And so explain in this 19-year period how we come to May Day 1886, who the key players are, both on the corporate side, the Chicago powers that be, and the activists who were organizing workers.
Well, first of all, the employers in the legislature had really decided that they were against an 8-hour law. Illinois had been the first state to pass one, and the employers simply refused to obey it. So that was the background of the labor movement saying, a wing of the labor movement saying we have to really compel employers to concede. And in fact, all during the spring of 1886, employers were conceding, just as you see people today closing down like your guest, and accepting the reality that they needed these workers, and if they would come back for 8 hours a day, they would have them. So as the May Day appeared that first time in 1886, it looked as though everything was going to proceed peacefully. Employers were conceding, but behind the scenes, people were getting their backs up.
I'd also like you to lay out the media landscape. Media absolutely critical today, the most powerful institutions on earth. That back then also extremely critical in shaping people's perception of labor that was organizing.
Yeah, it's fair to say that the daily press, and there were 8 dailies in Chicago at the time, were universally hostile to the strike, to any form of direct action, very, I think, anti-immigrant as well. And so the workers had to create their own press. There was a daily newspaper in German published, the Arbeiter Zeitung, that reached 20,000 people. So the workers had to create an alternative media. And then, of course, when the violence began, the media was really responsible for shaping public opinion and all the events that occurred afterward.
Who was in charge of, for example, the Chicago Daily Tribune?
The Chicago Daily Tribune was edited and published by a man named Joseph Medill, who was arguably the most powerful and influential journalist in the United States. And he had the ability to really shape what business opinion and what legal opinion in Chicago was. And he played a tremendous role in this. It's really hard to underestimate it.
Mm-hmm. And would you say it was a paper of the business community?
Yeah, it was announced itself as the paper of the businessman. And so they were very much opposed to the 8-hour day and very determined to identify radicals in the movement and to, in effect, to kind of bait the movement by saying it's led by revolutionaries, when in fact it was a broad, mass-based effort.
Karl Marx also played a role here.
Well, Karl Marx died in 1883, but his followers, there were many German followers of his in Chicago, among the cigar makers and others, and they believed in what he and Engels wrote, that the only way for workers to get power was to create a mass-based labor movement that included all the workers of the world, and that eventually this kind of movement could take over and create a cooperative economy that they called communism.
Hadn't Marx and Engels brought their organization to New York, to the United States?
They did. There was at the time something called the International Working People's Association, which was way ahead of its time in terms of seeing the unity of workers as extending across boundaries and national lines. And the people in Chicago were devoted followers of the International Working People's Association.
And he was also a close follower of the Civil War and of the Emancipation Proclamation, of what happened to slaves as they were freed.
Interestingly enough, Karl Marx wrote in English for the New York Tribune during the Civil War, interesting, and he saw the Civil War as the most important event in world history, that not only did it end slavery and liberate black people, but it created an 8-hour movement. And Marx and Engels really looked to the United States, to the U.S. workers, as leading the world struggle for justice and freedom.
We're going to break. When we come back, I want to ask you about Albert and Lucy Parsons. I want to talk about what happened after May Day, May 1st, 1886, what really shaped the modern-day labor movement in this country. I want to talk about the killings of May 5th. I want to talk about the riot. This is Democracy Now! We're talking to James Green, professor of history and labor studies at University of Massachusetts. His book is Death in the Haymarket, a story of Chicago, the first labor movement, and the bombing that divided Gilded Age America. Stay with us.